Good afternoon, everyone. So for those of you who don't know, my name is William Volvo. I'm the executive director of El Museo. El Museo is the organization in Buffalo that's presenting this with the help of a lot of people. So we're going to get to that in a minute. I want to just quickly thank a few people, and then we're going to hand it off. So first, I want to thank the Niagara Falls Public Library for hosting us. This is a really cool space. I've never been here before. We're going to get to go on a little tour, right? A little tour of this during our break. So I hope that you'll all join us for the tour. Our programs at El Museo, we're a not-for-profit arts organization based in the city of Buffalo. Our focus is primarily on underserved artists, artists of color, economically disadvantaged communities. It's a pretty wide net that we cast. And all of our programming like this is free and open to the public. If you're in Buffalo, I hope that you'll come check us out. We're open for the first Friday gallery walk in the Allentown neighborhood. So 91 Allen Street, Buffalo, New York, come check us out. And we're a state-funded organization, so I need to thank some people. Primarily, I need to thank the New York State Council on the Arts through their special art services and their architecture and design programs. This is an architecture and design funded program. I also need to thank the Graham Foundation. The Graham Foundation, do we have their full name in here? Well, I can't find it, but they're in here. The Graham Foundation, which we didn't expect their support, but we're really happy to have it. This project would not have been possible without it. We're also funded by the County of Erie and Gift for Greatness. And we're working with the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation, who you're going to hear from their executive director in a little bit. So thank you for all your help with this. And there's a lot of other people, so I'm not going to thank individuals. So I'm going to hand it off to Barbara, who's going to go over some of the AIA stuff, and then we're going to get into it. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Will. This will just take a couple of minutes. So those of you who are architects, engineers, planners, and need continuing education credits, we did get approval from the AIA for 10 HSW AIA credits, which are the ones that are really hard to get to that we all like to get. So if you would like those credits, you just need to sign up. If you're coming today and tomorrow, today is 4 credits and tomorrow is 6 credits. So make sure you sign up. If you forget to sign up, you can just email me and I'll make sure that it gets added. We will be submitting everything to the AIA next week. These are our required AIA slides, which we have to confirm and commit to doing, because we are very grateful that they approve this. And with that, hope that I did see a bunch of people sign in for the credits, so I'm glad that they're useful.
I guess we can both stay for this if you want.
Yeah.
Okay. So this event is organized by Barbara and I. My name is Brian Lee. I'm the curator at El Museo, and this was really a really large project. I'm really happy that this is happening. We're having an exhibition at our gallery that's looking at the history of the Shoreline apartments. And this project came up. It's been kind of incubating for a few years. And for those of you who are not familiar, the Shoreline apartments are a series of low-income housing developments in Buffalo. It's right by the waterfront on the west side. And this plan shows you the kind of full original scheme as it was envisioned by Paul Rudolph and commissioned by the New York State Urban Development Corporation, which is a state agency that was formed in 1968. So the full complex included a series of housing, a community center, a school, retail uses, and also this kind of marina portion that was never built. And in the end, only 2 phases of affordable housing were built. Today they're known as Shoreline and Pine Harbor. And I don't want to give too much away because we want you to come see the show, but this is kind of the signature image of the model that was constructed of the waterfront section. And that's part of why the original development was called the Buffalo Waterfront Development. And it was just this huge undertaking that was abruptly cut short when the UDC went bankrupt in the 70s as a result of President Nixon cutting off housing and community development funds. This is an image of the of Shoreline under construction. As you can see, this was a huge urban renewal project, and we'll be hearing a lot about that for tomorrow's discussions, so I hope you will join us. This is kind of the classic view of the Shoreline with the greatest hits of Buffalo modern architecture in the background, including many notable brutalist buildings like the Federal Office Building, the City Court, which is in the right-hand corner, and of course Marine Investment Center, sometimes known as HSBC Tower or Seneca 1 today. So without giving too much away, this is what the Shoreline looks like today. This is an image by David Torp, and we are, this symposium is really an opportunity to look beyond these really kind of iconic and powerful and sometimes really sad images, and to learn more about, how this piece of architecture is situated in a larger kind of social history. And to end, I'm going to show you this image. This is a fabric sculpture by Kurt Triebe. Two of his pieces are in the show, so I hope you will come check it out. We will have special open hours tonight from 7 to 9. If you're interested, please come by. We'll have a reception. Some of our guests will be here, and it will be a chance to take a look at some of the reproductions of archival documents and photographs of the Shoreline and some of artworks that are kind of situated around them. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Barbara, who will introduce our keynote speaker.
So I wanted to say a few words about why Brian and I are doing this, why Brian and I got involved in doing this together. And so those of you who don't know me, I'm Barbara Campagna. I'm a preservation architect and historian. I have an office in Buffalo. I'm from Buffalo, but was gone for most of my career till a few years ago. So in 2000, and I've been working as a preservation architect on modern heritage for quite a while. So I've been very involved in a variety of modernist nonprofits, including our national organization called DocoMomo, the Documentation and Conservation of the Modern Movement. And in 2013, I had a place here, but I was primarily living in New York City, and I got a phone call from the executive director of DocoMomo saying, "What is going on in Buffalo? There are articles today that Shoreline by Paul Rudolph is getting torn down." So I started looking around, and I called Tom Yachts, who's sitting in the back, and who was the executive director of Preservation Buffalo Niagara at the time. So we started looking into it, and yes, indeed, the owner had announced plans to start to tear down the first 5 out of, I forget what the actual number is now because they combined some, out of about 30 that are 30 of the buildings that are remaining. So we discovered that the Buffalo community was not interested very much in Paul Rudolph or brutalism. And I'm not an activist by any means, but I felt like Liz kept bugging me about doing something because I was the only member west of Syracuse. But Tom and I felt like there needed to be somebody to speak for the buildings, that there was this whole process going on and there was no discussion about the significance of the buildings, the significance of the concept when it was created in 1969. So we tried a variety of efforts. We met with the owners, but it basically failed. We even submitted a local landmark nomination. It had been identified as being eligible for the National Register in 2009, but the owners had worked out a deal with the State Historic Preservation Office to still be able to tear them down. So we submitted a nomination at the request of the Preservation Board to make it a local landmark, and that through a very difficult and unsavory process was denied. So we really had no political, there was no political will other than to tear them down. So that's when I sort of stepped back and stopped doing advocacy because I was really depressed and went back to being the consultant that I usually am. But in the meantime, what was interesting is a lot of people outside of Buffalo, and I mean, architects and historians, were very interested in what was going on. And a lot of national and international articles were written about it. The Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation was sort of blossoming at the time. They got involved and interested. I travel a lot and I go to a lot of conferences around the country. Every conference I go to, people I don't know come up and ask me what's going on with Shoreline because they've read the articles. Some I've read, some Mark Burns, who you'll hear from tomorrow, has written. And so it's kind of encouraging. We may be losing some of the buildings. 5 have been demolished so far, but the story is being told. And so Brian got interested in this, read some of my articles, and coerced me into applying for some grants to develop this program. So it's been a few years now. The first buildings were torn down in 2015, and it's basically been on hold since then. There's a legal suit, and there are a variety of other issues that the owner has not been able to get the continuing state and federal funding to tear them down. We all walked around this morning, and it's pretty depressing. The FBI has been allowed to use it for fake bomb practices, so a couple of the buildings do look like they've been bombed, which is really unfortunate. I mean, this complex is literally around the block from City Hall, and to have this so evident and continuing to deteriorate is a real blemish on our city. So you may not think you like brutalism. What does that mean? So we started talking about the fact that the buildings of this era often get a really bad rap, and people think that they're called brutalism because they're brutal, meaning ugly. You'll hear that there's a very different story. Some of you probably know what the story is. But there are many layers here. And we had a screening last night of the Pruitt-Igoe myth. And Dr. Taylor, who will be speaking tomorrow, was talking about the layers of public housing. So we have the issues of the architecture. This architecture was designed by a master architect, one of the great modernist architects in the world. He designed 3 buildings, including the one that we're sitting in this area. They're also tell the whole story of public housing, which in this country is not very pleasant. And it tells the story of urban renewal, and it tells the story of social justice. So what we wanted to do was use Shoreline as sort of the focus from which to tell these stories. So we're starting today with architecture and brutalism, and tomorrow we'll move to the social history, the urban renewal, and the preservation in public housing. So we hope that you will take back, if you are interested, if you have liked brutalism as I have for most of my adult life, that you'll have a maybe more nuanced understanding and understand why we feel that we need to be able to have the dialogue and tell the story. So with that, we're very excited that our opening keynote speaker is Kelvin Dickinson. Kelvin is the president of the Paul Rudolph Heritage Foundation. So he's going to tell you about Paul Rudolph, why he's a master architect, why Shoreline is so important, and why this library is so important. So he's been a great partner, as you heard from Brian. He and Brian spent some time at the Library of Congress making images and slides of many of the images that you'll see in our exhibit if you haven't been there, if you go there tonight. And he has some great stories about the buildings and about Mr. Rudolph. So welcome, Kelvin.
Great, thank you, Barbara. It's so nice to be in a room designed by Paul Rudolph talking about Paul Rudolph. The last time I was here was exactly 10 years ago. And the funny thing was I came not to see Niagara Falls, but to actually see this library. And the library doors were locked, so I only got to see the outside, so this is my first time to get to see the inside. I wanted to talk about what got me into Rudolph. And I also was intrigued about Shoreline because when Brian and I were talking about what should be the title of the exhibit, we wanted to bring in water, the idea of memory, the idea of remembering things, and because it was kind of being washed away as we were thinking about it. And so I wanted to talk about Paul Rudolph and really kind of understand and look back on why he was considered so important and why he's been kind of forgotten by American architects. I mean, if you're of a certain age, my age, you never studied him in school, unless you were at Yale maybe. And today, those students are starting to warm up to him. They're taught more in school. Back in the day before my time, he was everywhere. In the 60s, if you were in school, you saw everything. He was on the cover of every major magazine and books and things like that. So I was intrigued to understand what had happened to him when I first heard about him. So that's why I titled this Reflections on a Life and Legacy. I also want to say thank you to people who have brought me here, the El Museo team, William Vogel and Brian Lee, and Barbara Campagna, and especially to the Niagara Falls Public Library for letting us have this space in which to do the presentation. I want to speak about Paul Rudolph's work and the impact of several of very well-known architects had on him, and to conclude with the impact his work continues to have on several communities that for one reason or another chose to demolish their buildings by him. I got involved originally with Paul Rudolph. It was kind of a funny story. My senior thesis at the University of Cincinnati was around the time that Peter Eisenman was doing his building edition. And I remember being in my senior thesis crit, and I presented, which was a battered women's shelter, a giant concrete tower that sat on a hill. And the idea was that if you needed to use the facility, you could lock yourself away inside. And at the end of it, everyone was very nice and they were listening. And Peter Eisenman blurts out, "Your work reminds me of Paul Rudolph." And I was like, "Who's Paul Rudolph? I've never heard of the guy." And at the time, I didn't realize that Peter Eisenman kind of faked a heart attack. And one of my professors actually had worked for Mr. Rudolph and said to me afterwards, "You have to look this guy up." So I immediately ran to the library, pulled out Sybil Moholy-Nagy's book on Rudolph, and spent the next 4 hours looking at his renderings. And actually got kind of depressed because here I thought, this guy's done everything I want to do, but so much better and before I could. So that was kind of my introduction to Paul Rudolph. 10 years later, I wind up going to New York City, where I currently live, and I walked into a Paul Rudolph building, Moduliter, if anyone's been there. It's a lighting company that Rudolph co-founded with Ernst Wagner. And Ernst opens his home up. Essentially, he lives in it. And he allows people to come in and walk the building anywhere they want and sit down and talk to him about Paul Rudolph and what it was like to know him. And I was one of those people 10 years ago who walked in and sat down. And as soon as I realized that he had some great stories to tell, I never left. I essentially said to him, "Look, I want to be part of this foundation you keep saying you want to have." So he took me to the second floor, which was all dark and full of boxes. And if you can imagine, it's like the end of Indiana Jones. The government's got all those big crates. Well, this is what he had. And he said to me, "Okay, you're the foundation, get started." And so I opened up the first box, and there was 50 pairs of Rudolph's glasses. And I opened up the next box, and there were maybe a couple thousand slides of unpublished Rudolph projects, and drawings, and letters from his mother, and letters from everybody you can imagine. I mean, I found just recently, I still am going through it, a letter written by Walter Gropius saying, "Please don't send him to the Korean War. He's too good an architect." So, there's a lot of things still being discovered about him that unfortunately people in America have forgotten. I think overseas he's more respected. And so this is something that I've kind of taken over as a full-time job now, to go talk to people about why I think Rudolph's important. I want to start off with a little bit about his life, because I think that it's important to understand what he did, why he did it, and then we can get a better understanding of why people need to preserve his buildings. So Paul Rudolph was born on October 23rd, 1918, 101 years ago, yesterday, in Elkton, Kentucky, to Reverend Keener and his wife, Uri Rudolph. Rudolph's interest in architecture was sparked by watching the construction of a new church for his father and the drawings that were prepared during the process. From 1935 to 1940, Rudolph studied architecture at the Alabama Polytechnic Institute, now known as Auburn University, where he received his bachelor's degree. In 1940, at the age of 22, Rudolph went with his family to see the Neerbaum Rosenbaum residence, and I think that he actually forced him to go. It was a Wright-Usonian house in Florence, Alabama, and the emotional impact of the design left such an impression on Rudolph that until his death in 1997, he still talked about what that experience was like. At a friend's suggestion, Rudolph moved to Sarasota, Florida in 1941 to work for Ralph Twitchell. He was told that all the good architecture in America was being done down in Florida. But 6 months later, he left to study at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where he studied under Walter Gropius, and be exposed to the international style of modernism of Mies van der Rohe. Rudolph entered the Navy beginning in World War II after his first semester at Harvard. We have a lot of photographs in his personal collections. This was one of them of him in his Navy uniform, where he was stationed in the Brooklyn Navy shipyard, where he was put in charge of shipbuilding. His first major project, the Healy Guest House, also known as the Cocoon House, employed a sprayed-on roof technology that Rudolph discovered while in the Navy mothballing ships after the war. So this is his rendering, and then that is a construction photo. In 1946, Rudolph went back to Harvard and received a Master of Architecture. He returned to work with Ralph Twitchell, and together they formed the core of what became known as the Sarasota School of Architecture, which is a regional adaptation of modernism that featured open planning, a lightness of structure, free-flowing interior and exterior spaces, and modular construction. These are all examples of some of the projects during that time period. In 1948, Rudolph received the Harvard's Wheelwright Fellowship and traveled across Europe. And it was during this period that he was exposed to the principles of classical architecture and urban planning. He began to see how principles such as form and scale and material were universal and were not fully addressed in the modern architecture of the day. He began to understand that what he had seen when he was studying under Gropius, and what he was doing here was lacking something. In March of 1952, Rudolph left Twitchell's office then to start his own firm. So Rudolph began to travel as a guest lecturer and critic, and his practice grew throughout Florida. The Good Design exhibit, designed by Rudolph, opened in 1952 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, placing him among such distinguished designers as Charles and Ray Ames. Also in 1954, Rudolph traveled to Jordan to begin work on a proposed U.S. embassy, his first international project and his first public project outside of Florida. And here's the rendering that Rudolph produced for that embassy. In the fall of 1957, Rudolph was offered the chairmanship of the School of Architecture at Yale University and opened another office in New Haven, Connecticut. Rudolph continued to build projects in Sarasota, including the Deering residence above and the Milam residence, which is down below, which, by the way, is for sale if anyone wants to buy it. So Rudolph's designs for these last projects in Florida are notable for their emphasis of mass and expression over the previous focus on light materials, modular bays, and prefabricated components. The Milam residence was also his first project to incorporate air conditioning, thus freeing Rudolph from the design restrictions required to deal with Florida's oppressive heat. Shortly after assuming the chairmanship at Yale, Rudolph was offered a pair of construction projects on campus, Greeley Memorial Lab and a housing complex for married students, which eventually led to the project that was to define, for better or for worse, the rest of his career. That's the early scheme of the married student housing and the Greeley Memorial Laboratory at Yale, which was just recently renovated. In 1958, Rudolph was given a unique opportunity to design the building that he would occupy as Dean of the School of Architecture. In effect, Rudolph became both the client and the architect for the project during its design from 1958 until its eventual completion in 1964. Rudolph's design was radical, considering Mesian glass boxes, the kind you would find on Fifth Avenue still today, were the vernacular of the day. Located on a corner lot, Rudolph proposed a pinwheel-shaped plan consisting of 7 stories of studios which were spiraled around a central lecture space. He was also pretty famous as a result of doing a section which was published everywhere about the building. And there is one of many. I think he said he had done something like, 600 different sketches of the building before he did the construction drawings. The construction of the building was as innovative as the design itself. The building is almost entirely formed from concrete poured in place. Rudolph left the interior and exterior as exposed concrete and developed a vertical ribbed finish in place of traditional surface treatments. After casting the wall, vertical wood forms were removed and the projections manually knocked off using hammers to reveal the stone aggregate which was cast into the concrete. The effect preserved the verticality of the original renderings and achieved the look that Rudolph was looking for. Now, this is an Ezra Stoller picture. Rudolph obviously very excited about the new technology he employed, and that's a historical photograph of one of the workers constructing the Yale School of Architecture. From 1958 to 1965, Rudolph's popularity reached new heights, and he was offered larger projects and began to design buildings throughout the Northeast. At the age of 44, Rudolph had established offices throughout Cambridge, New Haven, and New York City. And by this time, he had already completed a diverse group of public projects, including the Jewett Arts Center, an office building for Blue Cross Blue Shield in Boston, and 2 schools in Florida. I think I skipped that. There we go. From 1960 onward, Rudolph began to question the architectural theories he had learned from Gropius during his time at Harvard. Rudolph said, "The last decade has thrown a glaring light on the omissions, the thinness, the paucity of ideas, the naivety with regard to symbols, the lack of creativeness and expressiveness of architectural philosophy as it developed during the 1920s. He then concluded that the end of architecture is to create space, that an appropriate psychological environment. One key to that problem is scale." Now, the notion of scale is often overlooked and misunderstood in architecture would be the focus of a dozen or so projects between 1958 and 1965. Scale at the human level, the building level, and the city would dominate his work for the rest of his life. The Temple Street parking garage in New Haven, Connecticut was designed by Rudolph to solve a growing urban problem: how to design a parking garage for over 1,500 cars in a way that both in scale with its environment and celebrates the automobile at the same time. Rudolph chose to double the supporting columns in a way that mediate the monumentality of the structure, which would be a tool that he would become a trademark throughout the rest of his career. Now, I want to point out that 2 things. That is a photograph that a friend of ours that's on our board took of Mr. Rudolph while he was visiting the construction site, and I would say he was pretty excited by being there. And then the other part is, this is actually an advertisement that was in a local newspaper that we found that Rudolph had clipped and saved, and it is an actual pen and ink rendering that a local advertising company had done promoting the construction of the new parking garage because they were so excited. We also found newspaper clippings where the owner of the parking garage had hired clowns, and they had a big circus, and they were handing sweets out to children who would come drop by to see the building opened, and all of this for a parking garage. As Rudolph searched for an appropriate visual expression for his re-examination of what he considered lacking in modern architecture, he continued to use the same bush-hammered concrete finish that he had developed for Yale's Art and Architecture building. During this period, Rudolph added the use of sculptured piers to his language of the repeated modular openings. At this time, Rudolph wrote, "Modern architecture's range of expression is today from A to B. We build isolated buildings with no regard to the space between them, monotonous and endless streets, too many goldfish bowls and not enough caves. We tend to build merely diagrams of buildings. One can say that the present tendency to reduce everything to a system of rectangles, both in plan and elevation, is an outgrowth of the modular concept in machine processes. We accept this discipline, but we still long innately for the old play of light and shadow and for something curved." Now, up until this time at Yale, Rudolph's work had been a progressive exploration of modularity and functionalism. The work produced while in New Haven began to focus more on expressive forms, the control of light and shadow, the play with scale, and composition of different types of space. That was what he was mostly concerned about. Rudolph began to see the need for space for the imagination as much as function. During this period, Rudolph focused on flowing, curving lines and sculptural masses. The articulation of the buildings resulted from exaggerations of the shapes of the functions within. That is Indo-Pharmaceuticals in Long Island, and the, I guess now refurbished Boston Government Services Center. Now, this is something that we'll specifically address in this building as well, because Rudolph moved away from as he moved away from functionalism and his buildings began to take on more sculptural qualities, He also had to deal with the fact that people also wanted the same finish as the Yale A&A building. And he realized that in order to do that economically, he invented some concrete blocks that would achieve the same look as his signature finish. Rudolph developed a number of concrete block types, which today you can find all over the world. And unfortunately, that means that it's sometimes hard to save buildings because what Rudolph had originally produced, which was very famous back in the 60s, now you can find a cheap shopping mall, a strip mall, or a Best Buy made out of the same block types. So these are the first two times these blocks were ever introduced. We've got 1962 Crawford Manor. That's a Rudolph drawing that I had photographed when I was down at the Library of Congress. And then these are the actual block types. So he actually found, and with somebody in his office suggested to Mr. Rudolph, hey, why don't you make a concrete block? And he agreed, and they did. And so what I have found is he actually, in the first fluted block, measured the diameters of every flute to make sure that they would be each made custom to the building type that he was making. In this case, it was Crawford Manor. Then the Dana Creative Arts Center in 1963, just a year later, is the first time that the ribbed concrete block was used, which is now what's used in this building. So the culmination of this period was Rudolph's design for Southeastern Massachusetts Technological Institute, which is now UMass Dartmouth. In this project, Rudolph conceived of the campus master plan as a spiraling internal mall with classroom buildings facing each other from either side. Originally to be a commuter campus, Rudolph surrounded this composition with a ring of parking lots, allowing for a separation between the scale of the automobiles and the internal scale of the green space. And then after 7 years of teaching at Yale, Rudolph left to practice architecture full-time, and eventually, in 1965, he moved his office to New York City. On the night of June 14, 1969, a fire broke out in the upper floors of the Art and Architecture building. A rumor spread that an unhappy student had set the blaze as a critique of what was seen as an increasingly difficult building to work in. When the building was renovated during the repairs, so much was altered that Rudolph said he didn't recognize it anymore. He considered, and he's said this before, that each building he designed was like having a child, he said. Rudolph would rarely speak about the building and not visit it again for almost 20 years. The rumors about the cause of the fire would forever damage Rudolph's reputation. At the end of the 1960s, Rudolph began to focus on creating complex compositions involving simple modular elements. He was influenced by Moshe Safdie's prefabricated housing at the Montreal World Fair in 1967, and he designed the Graphic Arts Center in New York City. Rudolph predicted that mass-produced mobile homes, what he had called the 20th century brick, would become the basic building block of the future. At the time, Rudolph was commissioned by the Ford Foundation as well, which is the lower left, to design a large megastructure as part of a proposed Lower Manhattan Expressway for Robert Moses in New York City. Now, originally Rudolph had protested with Jane Jacobs to the demolition of the building in New York City, Penn Station, and they were on the same side. It was interesting with Lomex, they were on the opposite sides just a few years later. Although neither of these schemes were built, Rudolph continued to be fascinated with modular housing prototypes, using them for smaller projects such as the Oriental Masonic Gardens in New Haven and the Green Residence in Cherry Ridge, Pennsylvania. The Green Residence, I've been there, is still in very good condition. Unfortunately, the Oriental Masonic Gardens suffered from pretty poor construction and bad use of materials because it was public housing, low-income housing. And as a result, those buildings were torn down 20 years later after the construction. In 1972, the second part that made Rudolph's career become more obscure, Robert Venturi and his wife Denise Scott Brown published Learning from Las Vegas, in which they compared Rudolph's Crawford Manor with their Guildhall in Pennsylvania. They argued that Rudolph's modernist building was too heroic and instead proposed the idea of a decorated shed. So they argued in their book that Rudolph's building was a duck, which they defined as where the architectural systems of space, structure, and program are submerged and distorted by an overall symbolic form. against their version of what they call the decorated shed, which are where systems of space and structure are directly at the service of program, and ornament is applied independently. Now, the argument was a sign of the changing currents in architecture away from Rudolph's monumental modernist works and towards what was now starting to be called the new postmodernism. While most of the projects during this time were private residences, Rudolph did have the opportunity to design Burroughs Wellcome headquarters in North Carolina. Much like his earlier work in concrete, Rudolph designed the building as a piece of sculpture, creating a space-age structure that appears to grow out of the top of the steep hills surrounding it. The Bass residence on the lower right and the Dean residence on the upper right are both examples of Rudolph's increasing interest in the complexity generated by overlapping simple forms. Now, if anyone here has seen it or have not seen it, I would suggest you go see Natalie Wood's last film, Brainstorm, which was filmed extensively in the Burroughs Wellcome headquarters. At the end of the 1970s, Rudolph designed a pair of towers for the Bass Brothers in downtown Fort Worth, Texas. In the design, Rudolph argued that the scale of a high-rise tower should be different between the base of the building, the middle, and the top. The idea that a building's scale is read at the base, shaft, and capital is firmly rooted in the classical architecture that he had been exposed to while he was traveling throughout Europe. Rudolph's concern about the experience of scale with regard to high-rise buildings would be a subject of exploration for the remainder of his career, especially as he began to design projects overseas. In 1981, Rudolph began to work on the concourse in Singapore. The complex was composed of three parts: offices in a tall tower, with apartments hovering above a shopping mall podium below. Rudolph created a different architectural expression for each part of the project, keeping with his belief that variety is an important part of urbanism. In 1982, Rudolph continued to explore scale in his design for the Dharmala Sakti headquarters located in Jakarta, Indonesia. Like he began to do in the design for the Bass Towers in Fort Worth, Rudolph created a heavily articulated podium with paired exposed structural columns. Above the base, the tower is segmented into repeated clusters of facades, which thereby create multiple scales within a single building. So as you can see, what he's done is he's taken one floor plate, repeated it, and then offset the other one at a 45 degree. So as you get close, the idea he thought that every building should have three types of scale. There's the scale as when you walk down the street and you can only see the lower 2 stories or 3 stories of a building, so that's the most tactile that you ever get to it. And then if you're down the street, in this case what you would see from, say, the far right, you begin to understand that there's a tripartite design. There's a base, there's a shaft, there's a top of the building. And then Rudolph always designed buildings never with flat roofs. So the third type of scale is the automobile. So imagine you're in your car and you're driving down the road and you can see this building in 5 seconds. You know, the elevator pitch of the building is always going to be the outline, the roof. And so in this case, the building always has parts that kind of pop up. In this case, it's the elevator core. The Bond Center was designed as a pair of twin towers on Hong Kong Island on the edge of the harbor in 1984. Because Rudolph disliked symmetry, the towers are not exactly the same. One is 36 stories tall and the other is 40. The base of the building, as with his previous designs, is a complicated series of bridges and mezzanines and tie the building into the city's elevated walkways around it. For the design of the Colonnade condominium project in Singapore, Rudolph returned to his idea of the 20th century brick that he had developed as part of the Graphic Arts Center in the late 1960s. Rudolph again varies the scale of the tower by raising it on a series of round columns exposed at the building's base, which give the building its name, the colonnade. The shaft of the tower consists of a series of repeated solids and voids, providing each unit with a double-height living room and a private terrace. In 1989, the Sino Land Company held a competition to design the tallest building in Asia, to be located in Hong Kong, known as the Sino Tower. For his proposal, Rudolph designed a structure similar to the Eiffel Tower. This building is going to be as tall as the Empire State Building. The legs of the building, 8 twin sets of splayed columns, rose 150 feet into the air to hold the hotel above it. The base of the building included the entrance, exhibition, and retail areas, and above the hotel, Rudolph positioned 6 blocks of offices with overhanging corners like those he used in Domala Sakti. The scale of the tower itself was divided into units of 10 floors each, with a vertical separation for mechanical services as well as for safety if there was ever a fire. Although none of the proposed schemes was ever built, Rudolph's design reflects his lifelong pursuit of the scale in high-rise buildings. So Rudolph continued into the 1990s to design large housing and office developments in Asia, most of which were never built. Institution Hill on the upper right in Singapore was proposed to be a series of interconnected towers of different heights to appear to grow out of the site. And then finally, his design for Gatot Subroto in Indonesia was also never built and consisted of multiple segments to break down the scale of the office complex. Now, it's interesting to note that this came in 1990. There's been several buildings done by some well-known architects that resemble it since. The original design, though, was he had a series of office towers, each individual, and the client, because I talked to the guy who built this model recently, said that the client wanted to have one tower, but wanted to bridge into the adjacent towers should his company grow, and he could still rent out the others. But he didn't like the idea of having this simple form of high tower kind of spiraling down. So what Rudolph did says, I'll do one better. I'm going to take it, break it into parts, and have them all connected with elevator and malls between them. So that's why the final assembly looks like a jumble of buildings turned on their side. So I next want to address the many ways Rudolph was influenced and how he found inspiration. You know, it's interesting that Rudolph, when I was looking at the drawings of the Library of Congress for this building, I expected to find a lot more than I actually did. I found some great renderings. Brian and I found some great construction drawings, but what was lacking was the inspirational drawings, you know, the little sketch on a napkin that kind of gives you the idea, what was this guy thinking? So I kind of want to talk about where did he get his influence from, because he was inspired by several famous architects, and in reality, while he did not follow any particular style, he tried to understand what he thought was important in architecture and how modernism could learn from traditional architecture so that a synthesis could be created that would include the best of both. So in order to do this, the first thing he did was create what he called the DNA of architecture. So he created a list of what he called the DNA of architecture, which were qualities of architecture that he considered crucial to any type of building. And those include site, space, scale, structure, function, and spirit. He noted that these were his list only, and that when he talked to people, he said everyone could come up with their own list of what they considered important, but this is what he considered important. Space to him, though, was the most important of all of them. At the time, he wrote, people, if they think about architecture at all, usually think in terms of the materials. While that's important, it's not the thing that determines the psychology of the building. It's really the compression and the release of space, the lighting of that space from dark to light, and the progression of one space to another, because one remembers in that sense. And these are some diagrams that we found in our archives in a slide that I scanned, one of the first I scanned, which was interesting because he's starting to diagram buildings that don't exist just so he can understand and put on paper what he was trying to think. So here's an example of how one of his travels overseas wound up affecting a building that he would later design. So Rudolph, who admitted he did not photograph or draw the places he visited, instead was a keen observer and knew what he liked and what he disliked. He wrote, I'm very selective about who I'm interested in. I would go around the world to see a Corbu building or a Wright building, but I wouldn't go across the street to see some things. I know it sounds terrible, but it's absolutely true, because I'm interested in feeling and understanding. I learn from traditional architecture. I don't learn from modern architecture by and large. That's the reason why I feel lucky to have traveled as much as I have. Rudolph would recall on his trip to Europe for the Wheelwright Prize that seeing the sun catch the columns of the Parthenon would later result in his use of ribbed concrete at the Yale School of Architecture. But Rudolph did find inspiration in 3 architects which he met and greatly admired. Those architects are Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, and Mies van der Rohe. So besides the Rosenbaum residence, Rudolph admired Wright's Taliesin West. And he wrote, "I think that Taliesin west of Wright's is a truly significant building because of the sequence of space which he has managed to achieve, as well as the relationship to the site and the whole use of materials, the juxtaposition of the compression of the stonework and the flying quality of the trusses and the beams, the light coming through the canvas, the whole manipulation of the natural light." Now, light was something that Rudolph was really interested in, besides space, to the point where he actually co-founded a lighting company. It started out with Rudolph's understanding that indirect lighting was to him the best kind of light because it made the wall, he said the walls then almost caress you as a result of being lit indirectly. And Wright, actually Rudolph did famously meet Wright at a trip that he took to Philip Johnson's glass house. And there's a great story that was published in which Rudolph talks about how Wright had never seen a dimmer switch before and sat the entire time and played with the lighting back and forth in between whacking the artwork with his cane that had been put around the space. And we only have that story because Rudolph wrote it down. Nobody else did. So some examples of Wright's inspiration on Rudolph would be the Bass Residence and Falling Water. So Falling Water was actually the original global architecture that came out in 1960, featured an introduction by Paul Rudolph, of all people. And Rudolph was impressed, and he keeps repeating this idea of thrust and counter-thrust of space. And he actually did several diagrams, and that's one of the diagrams up on the right that we found in our collection. But he did several black and whites that are reproduced in the book. And so the Bass Residence is probably his result of having studied what that kind of thrust could do in architecture. And then there's the famous comparison of Wright's Larkin Building with the Yale School of Architecture. So it's interesting to note that the Larkin Building originally was just a giant donut. And when Wright couldn't figure out where to put the mechanical services in the staircase, he pulled it off to the side as a last-minute aha. And that's exactly what Rudolph did. So in this case, Rudolph understood architecture, modern architecture in general, was constantly changing and adapting because modernism requires technology to keep changing and adapting as well. So in this case, Rudolph copied Wright's idea of the donut, only in his case, it's actually a pinwheel in 3D. But he also puts the circulation off to the side, just like Wright did, which allows the entrance to be from the side and not in the center, because Rudolph hated symmetry. He thought the only time you should ever enter a building from dead center is if you're entering a cathedral. So in this case, by having that off to the side, Rudolph's implying that the building will be added on in the future, which he thought modern architecture needed to address, this idea of constantly changing and never being quite finished. And so in this case, where do you think they put the addition? Right next to, on the other side of that, where the circulation is, years later. The other architect that Rudolph greatly admired was Le Corbusier. So Rudolph was deeply affected by his work and his use of space and his later use of concrete. He wrote, "I feel Le Corbusier's Villa Savoy demonstrated the sense of continuity of space, the unfolding space in an admirable way. It also stated eloquently Le Corbusier's feeling about man's relationship to nature, which has proved to be prophetic." Now, I don't show this tonight, but the best example, I think, where he learned from the Villa Savoy is his endopharmaceuticals, because he used the same thing with the open plan, the roof garden, and the ribbon windows that Corbusier had been espousing in Villa Savoy. But there are other examples of where Rudolph took inspiration from Corbusier. There's an example of, again, Rudolph did these wonderful colored pencil spatial analyses of Corbusier's Villa Sodom up on the upper right. And he also would be very inspired by the chapel at Ramchamps when he did his Tuskegee chapel about 7 years later. And then the Convent de la Tourette was actually the inspiration which created the very first rendering that Rudolph did for the Yale School of Architecture. Interestingly, though, and we have evidence of this, is the little hand that is in this photograph. This is actually in our collection at the Modulator building, and it was a hand that was given by Corbusier to Rudolph when Rudolph went to visit him in his studio in 1949. Now, at the time, Corbusier was obsessed with this idea of the open hand. Hadn't built it yet, but he was thinking about it, trying to convince people it should be installed at Chandigarh. Well, this was something that Rudolph had kept when he went to go see Corbusier in his studio. And Corbusier, knowing who Rudolph was already at that age, says, "Come see me, I'm in my studio." Rudolph was given this as a gift by Corbusier. Corbusier's wife gave him an apple and then sent him on his way. And so this is what's left from that moment where they met in the studio, where Corbusier showed Rudolph all of the concrete work that he was doing. So the other and final person that I think had the most influence on Rudolph is Mies. So what he learned about him, mostly in Harvard, he would kind of reject in the sense of it is too open, it's too structural, it's too functional. But he did write that he was upset. He did have a lot of writings about the Barcelona Pavilion, and he almost describes it in having a religious experience. He says the Barcelona Pavilion is Mies's greatest building. It is also one of the most human buildings I can think of, a rarity in the 20th century. It is really fascinating to me to see the tentative nature of the Barcelona Pavilion. I'm glad that Mies really wasn't able to make up his mind about a lot of things. Most architects probably could agree. Alignments in the marble panels, the mullions, or the joints in the pavement. Nothing quite lines up, and all for very good reasons. It humanizes the building. So some examples of Mies and his impact on Rudolph is Rudolph's study of space in the Barcelona Pavilion, which is, he did a whole series of these color pencil sketches. That's one of them, analyzing the space and the views as you walk through. His early work in Florida was also inspired. So there's Mies's Cantor Highway restaurant in 1946, and exactly 10 years later, there's Rudolph's almost identical design for a donut shop in Florida. All the need for feed and speed is what we did a recent blog post comparing the two. And then I posted this picture for someone who's in the audience who asked that I would put it in there. This is Orange County Government Center. Now, this is not a very Miesian looking building, but actually it's what Rudolph wanted to do with Mies. He always said, I want to do something but better. So in this case, Orange County Government Center was his understanding of Mies's breaking the box and Mies's understanding of implied space. And what he wanted to do was kind of take it and push and pull it and show that by having the boxes and the cubes overlapping each other, that Mies could be one-upped. And so this was his understanding of the use of implied space. He said the enclosed volume of one room often penetrates the adjacent room, which gives it a sense of belonging to each other, even though they were separate. Now, I want to conclude with an idea of remembrance, because a lot of these buildings we're talking about, some of them have been destroyed, some of them are gone forever. This building here, for instance, has been the subject of some recent speculation of whether it's going to be around much longer. And also, we were talking about Shoreline Apartments, which we know are in the process of being removed. So I want to show some examples of 3 different projects, what happened, why they were good, what happened to them, and what their impact of their loss was on their community. And the first one I want to talk about is the McKeel's residence. So the 1972 McKeel's residence was designed for Dr. Lewis McKeel's in Westport, Connecticut. Hanging over a green hillside, the horizontal composition stretches across the site and provides its owner with views, complete views of the Long Island Sound. Because it was only one room deep, every room had a view. Now, when the house was published in Progressive Architecture, Rudolph said the concept of the house was motion. The idea of thrust and counterthrust, expressed through the tension created by the overlapping and interconnecting spaces and volumes throughout the house, were what were important to him. And he was quoted as saying about the project, "I want 1,000,001 things going on at once, but they must be resolved and balanced, because it is through the resolution of tension that something can become dynamic." Now, this was the subject of a rather long preservation effort. What happened was the house was for sale. It was on a prime piece of land in Westport, Connecticut. There was a guy that wanted to buy it and tear it down and build a McMansion. The preservation community found out about this too late. Connecticut wasn't that organized at the time, knowing what they had on their hands. And so in 2007, this is what happened. So the house was demolished in 2007 after a lengthy court case, and we were around to try to stop the demolition. And what happened in this case was Dr. Lewis McKeel's, after the preservationists sued and went to court, the guy that wanted to buy the house took Dr. McKeel's, in his 90s at this point, and put him in the stand. And the judge asked Dr. McKeel's, well, tell me, is this a great building? And Dr. McKeel said, well, Rudolph wasn't that great an architect. He did what I told him to do. It's really my design. And the judge, not knowing architecture, said, well, I don't know who Paul Rudolph is, and it's your house. So the house was sold, and this is the result. Now, the impact was interesting. First off, that was what was built. So a 6,200 square foot house was put in its place. Interestingly, after we spent a couple of years trying to fight to save the McKeel's house, this house was put on the market 2 years after it was finished. Some other things happened, though. This is what really this was my first preservation fight, actually. I thought people gotta love Rudolph, right? And sadly was mistaken. And so I remember after hearing about the original client being coerced because he needed the money because he was, in his 90s, being coerced by the guy who wants to buy the house to get on the stand and to talk poorly about Mr. Rudolph, I thought, well, I don't, the judge actually said, well, if the preservation want to, they can buy it. They can save the house. And of course, we didn't have the money at the time. So the destruction happened. But there were some things that did happen. I came back to New York and I thought, there's got to be something we can do that doesn't cost any money. I had, by that time, scanned probably 4,000 or 5,000 images of Rudolph's work. So I created a group on Flickr. Now, Flickr isn't that big a deal these days, but back then it was the big deal for photography. And so I just dumped everything I had on Flickr, right? 3,000 images. I started a group called the Art and Architecture of Paul Rudolph. And there was 800 people that posted pictures of Paul Rudolph. So in a way, it was kind of a cathartic moment for me because I thought, at least, I don't want people to say, who's Paul Rudolph? So this group got bigger and bigger. And the other thing that happened was that a HADS report was written about the house. So we did actually get some accurate survey drawings. We were able to get a stay of demolition so that someone could go in and measure it. And the result of that measuring became the New Canaan Mid-Century Modern Houses Report. It was the first time that the National Trust for Historic Preservation became aware of the sheer number of modern houses like McKeel's residence that they weren't aware of at the time. Were actually in Connecticut and were potentially threatened with demolition. And so that survey is actually held up now as an example of, for future generations in Connecticut to make sure that these things don't happen. The next one I want to talk about is Shoreline Elementary. This was also something I was involved in and went to go see the building. The Shoreline Elementary was designed in 1964. It was located in Middletown, New York. And it was also noted because it was the first and only building designed by Paul Rudolph purposely at the scale of a child. The floor plan fit into the hill, raised each level by 3 steps, so that the children could it was an open floor plan, the children could stand there and feel like things were at their level. So everything was scaled smaller. The roof, interestingly enough, was shaped like the factories that the children's parents worked in that were in the same community. So those kind of chevrons of the factory roofs Rudolph employed in the school construction. And the whole thing was 1 story. So this is a photograph that Joseph Molitor took of the interior. And it was all off-the-shelf construction. It was all steel and concrete and fluted concrete block. There's an example of the dimension fluted concrete block that I found when I was at the Library of Congress photographing the construction drawings. And this is the detail that Rudolph put into this. Now, it's interesting because you would think that this building needed some maintenance, yes, but it was such a unique design, designed specifically for children, and it's an elementary school. Unfortunately, the community was kind of economically disadvantaged at the time, and they wanted a new school. And so they applied to get a grant to get a new school, but the grant required one thing. that they had to demolish this existing school. Even though the footprint of the new school was going to be off to the side, and there was ways that the parking lots did not require its demolition, they were not allowed to save this building. So consequently, this was the result. On December 18th of 2008, the voters of Middletown, New York Enlarged School District passed a referendum to acquire the adjacent property to build the new school. But at the last minute, a provision was added by the government to demolish the Shoreline Elementary School, and this was the result. Now, the result of the demolition, though, was also curious. A few years later, interesting, this is the school that replaced Shoreline Elementary. I think it looks more like a prison than a school, but maybe that's appropriate these days. And then what was interesting, though, the impact was almost of regret, because the students actually that grew up in the school came back years later, and they created an entire website with the support of the school district to celebrate the original design that they had just a few years earlier demolished. And this includes a great 3D rendering of the school. I suggest if you want, I'll give you the details, you can look it up. You can spin around and go in it and look at it, it's really cool. I'm upset because I wanted to do that first. But what was interesting was then there was a time capsule that they opened, and they also celebrate the fact that the time capsule was included. And I thought it was very interesting. Peter Barbone, who did a lot of work with Rudolph, left a note. And the note says, "May the students of your time be less troubled than ours, and the architecture greater." And I don't think he would be very happy with what replaced the original school. And then the final project is Orange County Government Center. So Rudolph originally designed this based on, believe it or not, an Italian hill town. He went to Europe, and he thought that when he was thinking about why to design a building, this is in Goshen, New York. It's a small town, very similar to Buffalo, 2-story buildings everywhere, traditional architecture. But what this was in the late 60s, he really wanted to give them this idea of a modern building celebrating democracy. So what he did was he creates this building around a giant square, public square, where all the offices had natural light and look out onto each other. So if you're there as a worker, you have a space to sit outside and talk with your other coworkers. The building itself is designed out of a series of cubes, and the cubes are based on this idea that everyone is same but different. Everyone has a small job or a big job. Bigger rooms require bigger cubes, and smaller offices require smaller ones. The whole interior, now this is important if you look at the interior, because the whole interior was these ideas of opening up, and that everything was, again, this idea of implied space. There was no place that was truly private, that everyone felt like they were part of the team. And so this was something that Rudolph really wanted to kind of bring into the community, and it was their government center. So what was interesting, though, was, they didn't like it. I mean, the people in the beginning did, but the people later said it was kind of, oh, it's big and boxy and ugly. But Rudolph broke down what would have been a massive building by making it much more smaller scale on the outside. Now, unfortunately, this wasn't people as much as the environment, but this was what happened not too long later, after the Hurricane Irene went through in 2011. The building was closed, they had water damage inside, and as a result, it was permanently shut, and they had to strip the building down to its concrete. There was a preservation fight. They were told they couldn't demolish all of it after a while. So what they did was they ripped down, I'll show you which part they did rip down. They ripped down the upper part in the center and kept the back and the front. The upper part in the center is now gone and replaced with a very large, boxy metal, almost like, someone called it an outhouse, which I don't disagree with. And this is what that looks like now. Looks more like a hospital than a government center. What's interesting is the design is completely opposite of what Rudolph was trying to do. Rudolph would never have a corner window like that. The idea that that's actually the main room where the community has their government meetings. The circle in the front door is certainly nothing Rudolph would have done. And as much as I like these light fixtures, that's what the interior looks like today. So the carpet, okay, it's orange. but everything else they've done is pretty much destroyed. This is very similar, actually, to what I think Charles Moore did to Yale shortly after the burning in 1969. And I personally think that it's probably the most extreme example of what not to do as an addition since Daniel Liebeskin's 2007 Royal Ontario Museum. It's just not something, and I think if anything is good taken from this, it's going to be, please don't ever do this again. And so this is kind of an idea, 3 different examples of where I think that Rudolph's work, not only is it important, but there's a reason to say that, but then in the hands of someone who's not a Paul Rudolph, this is the kind of stuff you get. And it's curious to note that the design award given for this did not come from architects, it came from engineers who liked the fact that they figured out how to fix the leaks. But otherwise, the building has not received any recognition. And so that's it. That's what I wanted to say about Paul Rudolph and kind of give you an understanding of why I think it's important that Rudolph's important to begin with, and some examples of how other communities have dealt with similar situations and tried to turn it into a positive. And so thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Calvin. We have a few minutes to take some questions if you have some questions for Calvin. And I will tell you, I don't think I told you this, that I was on an AIA Design Awards jury 2 years ago, and this was submitted. And I went ballistic because other people on the committee had no idea what it was. And they were talking about, oh, the new finishes. And once I explained what it was, all I can tell you is it did not get an AIA award.
Good.
So any questions? We will have a tour after a break and a tour of the building after this.
Great. Any questions?
Do you think the alumni of the elementary school, they've been contacted earlier on before the demo started? Would that create enough of a groundswell to support the demolition?
I think so. I think the problem with the demolition of Shoreline, it was interesting. We got sucked into the local politics behind it, which turned out to be more of the issue than the building itself. I think this is a problem in preserving in any small community. There's a lot of back channels that if you don't know and you walk into it, same thing happened at Riverview down in Florida, where we had someone from New York go down and talk. I think that the local community really has to understand that they grew up in that building. And if you wait long enough, those people are going to remember what it was like to be there. This whole idea of remembering the building, the Pruitt-Igoe that we talked about last night that we saw, was all of this understanding of memory and what it was like. And I remember looking out that window, and decades later they have remembrances. And I think the memories are what's really important to uphold when you lose a building. Interestingly enough, I'll tell you a case in point that I didn't mention. Those blocks that are in the Shoreline Elementary were corrugated. Were not corrugated, they were fluted. And the children had run up and down the hallways with their fingers and they left little black streaks at a certain child's height, about this high, up and down the hallways. And how we found out about the project was actually, that it was going to be demolished, was actually one of the students grew up, went to college, studied architecture as a result of having gone to school there, and called me and said, I don't know if you know me, but I went to school at this school. It's a Rudolph and it's going to be torn down. He was one of those kids that had run up and down that hallway with the fluted concrete block. And now, just a year ago, he showed up again, and now he has studied computer science. And he offered his services to basically take our archives, which we had digitized, but create a digital archive index of them. And so he has continued to support our efforts with saving Paul Rudolph. And that all was inspired because of him having gone to that school early on. Yes?
You mentioned that Orange County engineers were so happy that the roof didn't leak anymore. And one thing you haven't really talked about is that one of the reasons why a lot of these buildings were torn down because of troubles with leaking roofs, or anytime you try innovative.
Yes. Well, and yes, exactly. You said it better than I could. Every time you try to do something innovative, you're going to wind up maybe being ahead of the times. That's one of the reasons why his work with prefabrication didn't take off. It might have taken off today, but the technology back then wasn't good enough. I noticed today, there's coatings you can put on concrete that make it waterproof that didn't exist back in the day. The technology back then, those concrete blocks, a lot of them were handmade or machine-made individual units and not mass-produced. So it's interesting that today I think the technology would have made these buildings probably savable and probably easier maintained. I think, interestingly, no one's mentioned it yet, maybe you will, the history of this building and the roof leaks. Rudolph did get sued, for instance, over the roof in this building. And I've asked Ernst Wagner, who and I have had long talks about, he remembers Rudolph talking about this building. Rudolph was designing these complicated roof lines, these big light scoops and intersections and all these details. He didn't have AutoCAD back then. It was all hand drafting. Rudolph liked sight lines. So his staff would come in and they'd put in the requisite parapet, and Rudolph would come in and cross it off. I want to see that ridge line, and so there is something to be said for an architect being a little too ahead of time. But I do think, the technology is there. This building, for instance, all the technology is there. The manpower is there. The only thing you need is you need the right professional and you need money. And I think these buildings would be preservable. I think Shoreline would be preservable. I think this building's preservable. And it's just a matter of getting over that period where the building is back in fashion. It's that 50-year time period where most of these buildings are getting to be that age now. Yes?
Could you take a few minutes and talk about what your opinion would be about what Buffalo should do to keep what remains of the shoreline if we can and the Pine Harbor going forward?
Sure. Well, first I'd stop the demolition. That's pretty obvious. I think, look, I was just there this morning. I'll tell you a funny story. I came here to see this building, not knowing about Shoreline. And 10 years ago this month actually, I went to see this building and then got in the car and was driving back to New York. And as I'm going through Buffalo, I'm with a bunch of friends, and I said, "Oh, that looks like Paul Rudolph." And my friends are like, "We are tired of hearing about Paul Rudolph. Let's just get back to New York City." So I didn't get a chance to pull over and see any of these buildings in Buffalo. But having seen them for the first time up close and having photographed all the construction drawings down at the library, I think that the housing, what Rudolph did was pretty inventive. He took it was obviously public housing, but he had a density. He had a level of design that is there that makes those buildings far more interesting than what's replacing them. What's replacing them is low density. Rudolph was concerned about density, but density done well. I think Rudolph's idea was he never designed down to people. He took people and gave them a design that was worthy of being architecture. And so he put every effort into the design of those buildings that didn't make them look like public housing. They looked like, middle class or upscale apartments buildings. I grew up in something very similar in Columbia, Maryland in the 70s, and it didn't look much different. Maybe that's why I'm inspired by Rudolph to this day. But I do think that if they were refurbished and repaired in a way they could be reused for what they were supposed to be, which is housing. I understand, this obviously has a lot to do with more than just architecture. This has to do with a whole lot of other factors. I do think that Buffalo, like where I'm from originally, which is Dayton, Ohio, suffers from sometimes a period where there's people leaving, and so the housing stock becomes a lot more than what's required, and so therefore, if you don't need the housing, it sometimes will sit vacant. I think the worst thing that can happen to a building is for it to sit vacant. Usually, buildings sit vacant for many years before they're torn down, and that allows the buildings to go beyond repair. So I would think the first thing I would do is close in the windows and fix the roofs. But I think they should be reused. I don't see anything wrong with them, actually. And I think that they could be used as maybe, middle class housing as opposed to public housing. I think the density thing there and the sense of community, though, is far more inspiring than what's replacing them currently, which is kind of these almost like horribly designed, meant to last 20 years housing that when the 20 years are up, oh, well, who cares? The material and the warranties were only 20 years, let's tear them down again. And I think Rudolph never designed that way. But I don't know ultimately how what Buffalo should do otherwise, but that's what I would do. Someone else have a question? Sure.
The Art Center at Colgate University
It is. There is actually the art community moved out of it, and they are repurposing the building. I think it is now become a museum and not the Performing Arts Center. It was originally a Performing Arts Center. The building, they built a new building for it because it was outgrown, and they've moved into it. And I believe now it's just an art museum, but it's still there. It's still used by Colgate University, and it's got ivy all over the front of it, so it kind of looks more like Shoreline now than it does in that photograph. But yeah.
Okay, this will be the last question. Yeah.
So there's a lot of those buildings that are obviously in the United States, but specifically it seemed to be in Southeast Asia.
Right.
And so what was his link, who or what was the link to that region of the world where he was so prolific?
Well, so that's interesting because Rudolph's reputation, there was a time period in the mid 70s where I was going through his project list, and it was very hard to follow because if he didn't like a project, or if a project was embarrassing, or he did some public housing he didn't like in the Bronx, and I suggest you look that up if you want to see bad public housing. Nothing I would have taken a picture of. But he wound up getting to a point where he had no work in his office in the early 70s, such that he was doing Macy's. I think Macy's in Danbury, Connecticut was his, for instance. And so he was desperately looking for work. His model shop was empty. That's why he started the lighting company, for instance, was because no one was building models because he had no work. And so he started tinkering with models, with building light fixtures. So he kept himself busy. He met a guy named Henry Quee, who brought him, somehow there was a connection. I'm trying to remember, because there's a guy I'm working with on it who's writing a book about his work in Singapore. Henry Quee introduced him in the late 80s to Singapore and to a couple of other projects in Jakarta. Originally, there was the colonnade was supposed to be done by another architect, and it was not done very well. The apartments were very small, very boxy, and looked just like the rest of the buildings over there in Singapore. And because this was meant specifically for American expats, they asked Rudolph to come in and redesign the building so that the apartments were larger and something that Americans would be willing to live in. I think that was originally some of the connection. Rudolph was able to come in with a roll of drawings. In this time period, people respected architects to come in and sit at a fancy desk and wear a suit and have all their models of other people's buildings behind them when they were talking to you as a client. Rudolph would come in, sit on the floor, unroll the drawings, and get a pencil out and start drawing. Okay, what do you want? And that's what people liked over there. They liked the fact that they didn't have to go through a million middlemen to get to some well-known architect. They got Rudolph. Rudolph would sit on the floor with them with a pencil, and they designed together. And that's what really took off. I think you're going to find interesting that Rudolph got really appreciated in Asia. It was mostly because his style of modernism was still respected. Metabolism in Japan was still a big thing. They liked that he didn't change his mind. Rudolph and Johnson were very close friends, frenemies, I would say. They had lunch every Friday. And Johnson said to Rudolph once, he goes, your problem is you keep designing the same building over and over again, thinking people are going to like it. And Rudolph turned around and said to Johnson, I think your problem is you don't know how to design the same building. So, they constantly fought with each other, but Rudolph really got respected for not changing his mind overseas. And those clients stayed with him. They were all very well connected and very wealthy. And so there's a lot of private homes. As a matter of fact, I mentioned the guy that I'm working with is writing a book. We're working with him down at the Library of Congress, and he has discovered, I think, somewhere like 16 or 20 buildings designed by Rudolph that were actually built, but no one's ever heard of before. And they're all in Singapore. They're behind walls and gates. You can't get to them. And so he's writing a book on this to show people what he was doing. Interestingly enough, one of those is a right. Only what he discovered when he talked to the client was, the client said, I studied architecture, I loved Wright. So Rudolph goes, okay, I'll give you a Wright building, but I'm going to make it better. So, it's got a hip roof and the windows and everything else, but it's definitely a Rudolph. He was constantly learning and doing, and I think he was really well respected over there for that. But great. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Kelvin. So we have a break now.
Well, I think that we should just start the tour. We have the local history librarian, Courtney Gearhart, is waiting for us. So she'll show us around the building, and then we can. The next panel is scheduled to start at 3, but maybe we can make that 3:10 or 3:15. Yeah. So yeah.
And Kelvin is here through the whole symposium. He leaves Sunday afternoon, so he's around to chat. And he left his business card out on the front table too, so if you'd like to take that. And if you're in New York, you have to go see him at the Modulator building.
It's a great building.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so we'll be back here in about half an hour.
And so, if you'd like to join us at the tour, we can just go out this way.
I'm staying here.
Oh, you're staying. Oh, okay.